Chapter 8. Maybe I never told you that poetry was my very best friend, but he was. When I got home and had helped my dad with the chores and we were eating supper, the phone rang. It was Poetry's parents saying that if we'd like to, we could ride to church with them in our new car. I was glad. That meant Poetry and I could sit together in church. That is, if we promised to be good and not get into mischief. But it would be a hard promise for a boy to keep, especially if he was sitting beside Poetry, even in church. His being mischievous didn't mean he was a bad boy, though. I knew he wasn't. Some boys are made different from others. I guess and Poetry was that kind. Right after supper, Dad had me drive the cows down the lane to the pasture. Be sure to shut the gate and hook it good and tight, he called to me just as I left the barnyard with our 5 big Holstein milk cows. I will, I called back. With a long stick, which I always used when I was driving the cows, I trudged along happily, thinking about tomorrow and wondering what we'd find, or if the map had been drawn by some crazy person and didn't have anything to do with the bank robbery at all. That was about the oldest and dirtiest envelope I've ever seen. The map looked as if it had been drawn 100 years ago. Well, 25 years ago, anyway. Or maybe 10. I heard Mom's voice calling me to hurry or would be late for church. When I got up close to the house, I heard her complaining a little to Dad, saying, "Whatever makes that boy so irresponsible?" Or some such long word. And Dad said, "He's a dreamer. He'll be all right if we give him the time." Pretty soon Poetry's family was there, and we were all in their car going up the long lickety along and we were all in their car going up the road lickety sizzle toward our church, which was maybe 2 miles from where we lived. We boys all lived out in the country, in about the prettiest spot in the world, I reckon. Right across the road from the church, which was a country church, was a 3-room schoolhouse. It wasn't the school we all went to. We had a little 1-room school of our own right in our neighborhood. It didn't take us long to get out there. It wasn't even dark yet. And our car was the first one to drive into the big wide churchyard and park. Soon people came from all directions, and then the service began. Poetry and I held the songbook together, and I noticed he didn't look at the page more than half the time. He just growled along, singing sort of bass, knowing most of the words from memory, since he liked poetry so well. The meeting wasn't exactly the kind of appeal to red-blooded boys like us, but we liked the music and the minister's prayer which wasn't too long, and his sermon, which was easy to understand and wasn't too long either. Then they had what they call testimonies, and different people would stood up and said nice things about Jesus and how much they loved him and how their prayers were answered. Things like that. I just sat kind of trembly on the inside because I love Jesus too. Maybe as much as any of them did. And I was wishing the minister would say, now if any of the boys and girls would like to say a word, we'll ask all of the older people to keep still for a few moments. But he didn't. So I just sat there wishing I'd dare to get up anyway, but I didn't, half promising myself I'd do it next Thursday night, even if they didn't ask for boys and girls too. Hadn't Jesus died for boys and girls as well as for grown-ups? Even if I didn't know very much about it, I knew I loved him anyway. Poetry didn't get up either. He was being bashful on account of his voice being squawky, although I reckon that wouldn't really have made any of a difference to the Lord if Poetry really loved him. Pretty soon, while the minister was talking again, Poetry and I almost jumped out of our seats when he said, "This afternoon I was called to the hospital to see a man who was supposed to be a bank robber. He was just a young man, too. Poor boy. He was all broken up about it. Said he hadn't done anything wrong and was out there in the swamp looking for something. Poetry's hand was gripping my arm so tight I could hardly keep from saying ouch. Then our minister asked us to pray for the man that he might be saved because he wasn't sure the boy would ever get well, and even if he did get well, he ought to be saved anyway. Poetry and I didn't pray out loud, like some of the rest of them did, including my dad, but we prayed quietly anyway. Even if our eyes were wide open, there wasn't anybody in the world that could pray better than my dad could, not even a minister. He prayed especially for the boy in the hospital. Then he prayed for all the boys in the neighborhood and for all the boys in the world, who he had said would all grow up to be either good men or bad men, according to whether they became Christians when they were boys. I guess Poetry must have felt like I did because I saw him put his hand to his eyes quick like and brush away something. I was thinking, what if that boy had been one of the Sugar Creek gang, or even Poetry or me? Of course, he was 18 years old, and I was only 10, and Poetry was only about 11, or maybe almost 12. Well, the next morning my dad drove away in our car and was gone for about an hour and a half. When he came back home, I saw him take his big black Bible out of the car and carry it into the house and lay it on the table. He said he'd been to the hospital to see Barry Boyland, which was the name of the robber, if he was one. My dad was kind of happy, too. He's better, he said, and the doctor thinks he'll get well in maybe a week or two. What else? Mom asked. Even if he doesn't get well, he'll be all right. It'll be all right, Dad told her, because He took Christ into his heart this morning, and he's saved now. Bob seemed awful glad to hear that. She liked boys, and she wanted them all to be saved. And he wasn't a bank robber at all? She asked. They don't know yet. He says he wasn't. Says he lived out in California, that his parents were dead, and that he used to have an uncle that lived around here somewhere, and he had come to look him up. I asked him why he had been carrying a gun, and he said somebody told him that there were bears up in the hills, and he was afraid not to. And that when he saw the sheriff and his posse, he was so scared his gun accidentally discharged. They thought he was shooting them, and because he had black hair like the robber was supposed to have had, they shot him back, just to prove he really was telling the truth. Dad went on. He showed me a picture of his uncle, which he had with him, and I've brought it home for you to see. Dad took a picture out of Dad took out of his pocket a picture about the size of a postcard. Mom gasped the way she did when she was terribly surprised and said, "Oh, Old Man Paddler! Why, let me see," I said, getting there as quickly as I could. "It's nothing," Dad said, not wanting to get me excited, I guess. "It's just a picture of an old man who used to live up in the hills, but who disappeared about 10 years ago, when you were a baby." He handed the picture to me, and it was my turn to be surprised. In fact, I never was so surprised in my whole life before. The picture looked exactly like Poetry did when he had on the wig and the long whiskers. "What's the matter?" Dad asked. "Nothing," I said. Then I added, "Did he really die 10 years ago?" "He must have," Dad said, "although nobody seems to know what became of him. That's his old cabin up in the hills. You've seen it, and people say it's haunted. Maybe because nobody knows what happened to the old man. Anyway, I told Barry Boylan his uncle was dead, and he seemed very much disappointed." I guess you can tell that I, Bill Collins, was listening for all I was worth to my dad was saying, and thinking and trying to figure out the way Dad described the robber. He was the same one we'd seen yesterday, feeling around in the old hollow tree. I kept thinking about the wig and whiskers, and the dark glasses that Poetry had found, and the funny map with the picture of the old man in bed. I thought maybe Barry's uncle was the crazy old hermit. Maybe he even drew that map himself, and maybe he hid it there too in the old tree, and hid the disguise there too. But why? I asked myself. Anyway, maybe we boys could find out that afternoon. Now that we knew there wasn't anything particular to be afraid of, it would be like some new game. Only a whole lot more mysterious. Soon it was dinner time, and right after that it was 1 o'clock. The gang was all down at the spring, circus, dragonfly, poetry, Little Jim with his gunny sack, um, Big Jim with his tape measure, and me, Bill Collins. First I told them what Dad had said about the robber not being a robber at all, and about him being saved. You should have heard Little Jim sigh with relief, just as if he'd been carrying something heavy for a long time, and somebody suddenly lifted off his shoulders. Even Circus seemed glad. There happened to be an elm sapling right there. He shimmied up it like a squirrel and stood on the first limb and slapped his hands against his legs like a rooster flapping its wings after he's just won a fight with another rooster. And then Circus crowed in the way that crowed in a way that sounded like our old red rooster at home. We called a meeting and decided we'd start looking for the treasure, or whatever it was, right away. If we found it, we could help pay the hospital bill for Barry Boylan. You see, if he didn't have any parents, maybe he wouldn't even have enough money to pay it himself. And if he was a robber, well then maybe we'd find the stolen money and get a reward. So pretty soon we were all there at the old tree again, measuring off 20 yards this time, which is the same as 60 feet, you know. It looked like 60 feet was going to be right under the biggest wild rose bush of all, the one with the sharpest thorns. We measured all over again to be sure, as near as we could figure, going straight east. That was just where it was, and that meant that whatever buried there, if anything, must have been buried before the rose bush started to grow a long time ago. We just walked around, all of us being barefoot, couldn't decide what to do. And little Jim laid his gunny sack down right under the bush, laid himself down on top of it, and started raking away at the leaves and dead grass with his stick. We knew he'd found something when we could hear a stick scraping something hard. Big Jim got excited, and in a jiffy he was down there too, digging away with the woodsman's hatchet he'd brought. We were all pretty disappointed at what they found. Nothing but a flat rock about a foot wide, all overgrown with moss and half buried in the earth. We stood there looking at it and felt spooky, for if you could see it plain as day, that it wasn't an ordinary rock. The fact is, it looked like a little bit like an old-fashioned tombstone, like the kind we have in our church graveyard, only it was lying down instead of standing up. Big Jim was digging around it and was just about ready to pry it out and turn it over to see what was under it, or else what was written on it on the other side, when Dragonfly said, "Psst! Somebody's watching us! I saw him right over there in the bushes!" I tell you, it didn't take Big Jim long to cover that stone with the dead leaves and dried grass, or for all of us starting to act natural. Poetry was the first one to get started, having maybe 100 poems tucked away in his mind somewhere. He dropped flat on the ground anyway, as flat as he could, and made a mournful face, and with his hand up to his head said, Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. Circus was already lying on his back, swinging his feet up and down and saying, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, up, down, whoa. Big Jim crawled out from under the rose bush, rubbing his eyes and scolded us for waking him up. He talked so loud and looked so fierce that for a minute we thought he meant it. Then he yawned and acted awful sleepy. Look, fellas, I cried, holding up one of the roses I'd just picked. Look at these pretty yellow stamens all around the green and white center. Why, this rose only has 5 petals, I said, surprised-like. A statement, is the part of the flower that carries the pollen. If flowers didn't have them, you could plant 1,000,000 seeds and none of them would ever grow. Ah, that's better. Okay, where was we? But none of the boys were paying attention to me. So I started looking for birds with my binoculars. In a moment, I was looking at a big red-winged blackbird swinging in the top of a little tree along the creek, his scarlet shoulders shining in the sun. I swung the binoculars around as though looking for some more birds, and then I saw somebody, sure enough, right over in the bushes. And would you believe it? He was an old man with long white hair and whiskers, only he didn't have dark glasses on. Yes, sir, he looked exactly like the picture of the old man He looked exactly like the picture I had seen of Old Man Paddler less than 2 hours ago. I lowered my binoculars quick as I could, quick as I looked around to see if Poetry was still with us, and he was. Well, that meant we'd have to stop looking for the treasure now, and wait till we were sure nobody was watching us. In fact, Big Jim said we'd better all go in swimming and come back later. We were just starting to leave when the man came out from where he was hiding and began hobbling towards us, looking awful mean-like. You could tell he was angry about something, for he waved his stick and shouted, "Get out of here! Don't you know this is private? His property belongs to me? You little rascals, get out, I say! Run, or I'll have the law on you!" "It's Old Man Paddler!" I cried, and started to run. In a flash, the whole gang was running helter-skelter through the woods. just as fast as we could. And we didn't stop until we got to the spring, where we all dropped down on the grass and rested a minute so as to catch our breath and get cooled off before drinking. That's what you're supposed to do when you're hot, no matter how thirsty you are. Did you ever see a man so mad in your whole life? Dragonfly asked. I never did, Circus said, filling one of the paper cups. Of course, we'd all heard about Old Man Paddler living up in the hills a long time ago. We'd been up to his empty cabin 2 or 3 times, but he was supposed to be dead now. Everybody said so, yet we'd seen him with our own eyes this afternoon, hadn't we? How can a man be dead if he's and still be alive? Maybe we saw a ghost, Circus said. My dad says this swamp is haunted, but I never believed it before. There aren't any such things as ghosts, Little Jim said quickly. 'Cause my mother says the Bible says that when a man's dead, he's dead for good, and that if he doesn't go to heaven, then he goes to that other place, and nobody ever comes back again. Somehow I knew Little Jim was right, but I decided to ask Dad about it when I got home that night. Anyway, Big Jim still had the map. He said it probably belonged to the old man, and we'd have to give it back to him. Maybe he had something buried there, and after being away for 10 years or more, he'd come back to get it. We decided not to go back today, but to keep it a secret about the old man because we didn't want our folks to worry about us. When I got home, I had the grandest surprise waiting for me, and you'd never guess what it was. Let's hurry and get your chores done, Bill, Dad said. You've been such a good boy that you may stay all night at the Thompsons, and you and Poetry can sleep out in their backyard in his tent. Well, that was something I'd been waiting to do ever since school was out, and Poetry had put up his tent. You can guess I didn't waste much time helping Dad with the chores, even if ordinarily I am kind of lazy about it.